Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of November. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Donetsk. This the capital of DPR. Donetsk, this is Donetsk. As you can see, there are a lot of icons, dozens of icons, that shows that Ukrainians during the day were attacking this town heavily. Today, during the day, we got a lot of updates from this town about casualties among civilians, about casualties among innocent civilians. Today, we got a lot of updates, a lot of pictures of the ruined buildings, and so on. So, as you can see, the Ukrainians were targeting mainly the central part of the town. As you can see, there are a lot of high buildings in this area. So that means that this is complete residential area. There are no railroads near this area. The main railroad is located on the, let's say, northwest part. There are no railroads. There are no warehouses. There are nothing like this. But the Ukrainians were attacking this area heavily. Before I start recording this video, we got reports. We got update about 8 killed civilians in this town and around 12 wounded during the day. But I believe that these numbers will be updated during the day, during the night, because the Ukrainians are not planning to stop. They understand that this is the only thing that the Ukrainians are able to do to stop the Russians, to stop their development of their bridgehead around Donetsk, and this is the only thing that the Ukrainians are able to do to stop the Russians near Bakhmut. Because if we're talking about Bakhmut, the Western sources are saying that the losses of Ukrainians per day is around 500, 800 soldiers per day. These are very big numbers of losses, and the Ukrainians can't do anything with this. If we take a look at this map, we see that the front lines has been stabilized, but it doesn't mean that nothing happened there. The Russians have a lot of artillery. If we compare, at least the Ukrainians and the Western sources are saying that for one Ukrainian shell, we have around 8 Russian shells in this area. So you see the ratio. So that's why we understand that the Ukrainians loses in this area and they are forced to move more and more reserves to this area to stop the Russians. We understand that these reserves are not endless, and we understand that when you can't break the situation, when you understand that sooner or later this area will be collapsed and taken by the Russians, we understand that it's obvious that the thing that Ukrainians can do in this situation is to attack and shell Donetsk as an act of revenge, as an act of bad mood. I don't know how to explain. Of course, all these attacks is not explainable. We can't compare Donetsk with any other single town in Ukraine. Yes, the Russians during the first stage of special operation were attacking and shelling Kharkiv heavily, but we haven't seen such a things in Kharkiv as we can see in Donetsk these days. Yes, we know that the Russians attacks Kiev with rockets, missiles. The Russians managed to cut off Kiev from energy, but we haven't seen such a shelling as we see in Donetsk these days, because Donetsk is under fire every single day. If we're talking about the western part of Ukraine, about the Russian rocket attack, the Russians do some pause in 1 week, and 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, and then they repeat their attacks and so on. But if we're talking about Donetsk, the Ukrainians attack this area every single day. And people need to go to their job, they need to earn salary, they need to eat, they need to do something. They can't sit in their basements, they can't leave this town because they don't have any other place to live. So they are prisoners in this situation, and the Ukrainians use this situation in their favor, trying to push, to attack this area. They're trying to force the Russians to do mistakes, to make them angry, because we understand if a person is angry, then this person might do mistakes. And of course, we understand that a lot of soldiers that these days storming Marinka, that these days trying to develop their offensive operation in Nivoysk, in Первомайsk, in Vodyana, in Oputna, all these guys, they have families in Donetsk, because Mainly the local soldiers, the local people from this area served in the Russian army on these front lines because they know the area, they know the ground, they know they're local there. So this is, of course, they fight as close as possible to their apartments and so on, and they see that Ukrainians attack this heart of Donetsk, heart of Donbas area, and of course it makes them angry. And of course, in this situation, these soldiers might do mistakes. They're losing in this situation their cold heads, and of course, this situation might lead to more losses among the Russians. So this is the situation. If we're talking about this front line from, let's say, Velika Novoselovka to Peski, as you can see, there are a lot of icons on the front line as well. The Ukrainians made a number of counter-offensive operations in direction of Novodarivka and direction of Volodymyrovka. They were trying or planning to restore their positions in these areas that they lost during the previous Russian counter-offensive operation. And as a result, all those attacks were repulsed by the Russians, and as a result of Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, they lost around 30 soldiers and something around 5 armored vehicles. Very interesting updates we got from Novomikhailivka front line. There are a lot of very interesting updates about Novomikhailivka and Marinka. There are very heavy clashes in the middle of Marinka. The party stopped on this territory. The Ukrainians moved their reinforcements. The Russians tried to push the Ukrainians as far as possible from the middle part of Marinka. And we understand that all this clash, all this shelling of Donetsk is tightly connected with this storm operation as well, and with the thing that Ukrainians during the previous weeks managed to deploy their 55th Artillery Brigade. We need to understand that responsible for casualties in Donetsk lays on this 55th Artillery Brigade that were deployed in this area on the 30th of November, so just less than a week ago. This is this brigade who is responsible for all these losses and casualties among civilians in this area. And the Ukrainians have a stable defense orders. We understand that from one point of view, this tactic is very cruel, humanless or something like this. But from another point of view, we understand that Ukrainians don't have any other option. This is the only way. This is the only way. How can they stop and reduce and to destroy their enemy? This is the only option for them. If we're talking about Peski front line, this evening we got updates that the Russians started storming operation of Nivoyska. So they got very close to this town. Now they started some kind of artillery preparation. I'm not sure about the status of these trenches. Maybe these trenches have been already taken by the Russians. Maybe not. Maybe they're in the gray zone. But anyway, the fact is that the Russians started attacking this area. Mainly the Russians are doing some kind of artillery preparation in this block of Nivoyska, trying to destroy these barracks where the Ukrainians are trying to hide their artillery systems, their armored vehicles, and so on. There are no clashes inside of this town, but anyway, the Russians are very close to start this. If we are talking about Peski frontline, Pervomaisky frontline, the Ukrainians during these days did the same thing that they did before. If we take a look at the Western sources map, if you remember, a few days ago we discussed that the main area where Ukrainians have their forces is Nitailovo-Pervomaisky, and there is one important road that Ukrainians have is between these two water reservoirs, and the Ukrainians send their armored vehicles on this area, and from this area they try to attack the Russians in their flank, those Russians in their flank who tries to storm Vodyana. So today there were another updates about the situation that Ukrainians were trying to attack. Those attacks were repulsed, and the Ukrainian lost some number of their armored vehicles in this area. If we're talking about Avdiivka frontline, about Verkhnitoretsk, Bakhmutovsky frontline, no changes in this area, no updates on the map, and so on. If we're talking about Mayorsk, today the Ukrainians continue attacking this area as well, trying to reduce the Russians' capabilities in this area. But there were no movements, no development of the bridgehead, and so on. If we're talking about Donetsk front line, when I'm talking about Donetsk, we can say about the North Donetsk. The Russian Ministry of Defense called this front line as Donetsk front line. So this front line starts somewhere at Piesky, and this front line ends somewhere at Soledar. So the towns that are located on the north of Soledar is Lysychansk or Lyman front line. So the Russians reported that during the clashes in this area, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 60 soldiers and something around 5 armored vehicles. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians were continuing improving of their fortifications around Klishevka, trying to build as much as possible fortification lines. Was one purpose to slow down the Russians. They had made a few counteroffensive operations in direction of Kurdyumovka, Andreevka, Mayorsk, but all those attacks were repulsed by the Russians. If we are talking about Yakovlevka, Bilogorovka, about Charlie Group, about this area, the Russian source map has been updated a little bit. As you can see, they have improved their border, their territory that is under their control. Now we see, according to this configuration of Frontline, Sporna has appeared in a small back. The Russians attacked this area from many sides, but they still can't return control over this town or force Ukrainians to step back in this area. If we are talking about this area from deployment perspective, we have one important update, and the most interesting, the most important is that the Ukrainians deployed their motorized brigade, 57th motorized brigade. They deployed this brigade on the 4th of December. As you can see, this brigade was deployed on the area of Ivanovska. So as you can see, from now on, Bakhmut is the most concentrated area with the Ukrainian forces. There are at least 4 mechanized brigade, or even 5. There are tank brigade, there are a lot of motorized brigade, there are special forces. So the best Ukrainian forces are located in this area. And their main goal is to reduce and stop the Russians and not to allow them to take control over Bakhmut. This is like a battle wall for wall. For now on, there are no even like talks or even discussions about possibility of encirclement of Bakhmut. There are too many forces, and to encircle Bakhmut, the Russians need to take, if they want to do this from the north, they need to do something with Soledar. For now, there are no progress in this town. I saw a lot of videos and a lot of pictures from Soledar. All this area is completely reduced to ruins. There are no place to hide, and I believe that Ukrainians are not going to step back, and the only option that the Russians have is to reduce this town entirely to ruins. And after that, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back. But the question is that the Russians won't be able to have any places to hide. All this situation will be mined, so I'm not sure about the Bakhmut. The only key that the Russians achieved and have, like the only benefit that the Russians have on the battle for Bakhmut is artillery superiority against the Ukrainian artillery superiority. As we discussed, the ratio between the Russian shells and the Ukrainian shells is around 8-1. So we understand the difference, and this is the only possible way for the Russians to pin down and to reduce the Ukrainian army in this area. But we need to understand that, of course, Russian artillery is mainly blind artillery. That means that they're not using shells like Excalibur. They have, but the number of these shells is, of course, is not very big. So it will take a lot of time before the Russians will be able to do something in this front line. And as I told, as we discussed, I believe that the next 2 weeks we aren't going to see any changes on this front line. Maybe the small local. And the most important reason is that Ukrainians deployed so many forces on this front line, so it will take a lot of time while the Russians will be able to reduce them. If we are talking about Lyman front line, it's the area between Sporna and, let's say, Makiivka, so this small area. The Russians reported that all attacks from the Ukrainian side were repulsed in this area. The Ukrainians lost around 80 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles. The Russian source map has been updated a little bit. They added small square meters to the territory that is under their control. Furthermore, they reported that during the day they had This information was included into the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, that as a result of counteroffensive operation in this area from the Russian side, they managed to improve their positions and to take few checkpoints, but the Russians didn't provide the coordinates or geolocation, so this icon is is very soft. And so, to tell the truth, for now, nobody knows where the Russians managed to improve their positions in this area. If we're talking about Kupyansk front line, the Ukrainians made the same attempts as they did before. They were attacking in the direction of Kuzyumovka, they were attacking in direction of Svatov, their main direction, and as a result of those clashes, the Ukrainians lost around 65 soldiers and something around 3 armored vehicles. Another important updates came today from Kursk, and this morning the Ukrainians attacked another airport on the territory of Russian Federation using drones. This morning we got updates about the previous Ukrainian attack that we saw in Saratov yesterday and that we saw in Ryazan yesterday. The Russian military experts reported that the Ukrainians used not the old Soviet drones, that Ukrainians were using the drones that they were provided by the United Kingdom. So that was some kind of very modern drones. And maybe this is the reason why the Russians can't see them and why these drones are able to cross and to get so deep on the territory of Russian Federation. I believe that these 3 attacks weren't the last. I believe that now it's going to be a normal practice from the Ukrainian side. They will attack the Russians using drones very often. Or at least the Russians will be able to establish air defense in this area. But the question is whether they are able to do this, to establish the stable air defense against these drones. If we're talking about Belgrade, another important update that the Russians decided to prepare some kind of analog of Ukrainian territory defense. So Belgrade is the first town where the Russian authorities decided to prepare to create local territory defense forces. A lot of experts are saying that in January we're going to see another wave of mobilization process in the territory of Russian Federation, but these experts are saying that it will be not the same mobilization process as we saw in October. Or in the end of September, in October and November, because the Russians are not planning to to send the applications to visit recruit centers or something like this. I believe that the next step of mobilization process on the territory of Russian Federation is going to be a creation of such a territory defense forces on the territories that surrounds Ukraine. It will be Bryansk region, Kursk region, Belgorod region, Voronezh region, Rostov-na-Donu region. So these territories that around Ukraine, the Russians, I believe that starting January, they will start creation of territorial defense. And we can understand this because the Russians started their mobilization process on the 20th of September. So I believe that all those people who was mobilized used to serve in army. It's not the people who is new to these military things. They know how to carry gun and something like this. So they're very experienced guy, but of course they served in the army for many years before this special operation, or maybe 2, 5, 10 years. And the training process, or let's say the process of restoring of knowledges, takes around 2-3 months. So if the Russians started their mobilization process on the 20th of September, so I believe that by the end of December, 20th October, November, December, 3 months passed since the beginning of this mobilization process. And I believe that all these guys will be trained and they will be sent on the territory of Ukraine, or on the territory of special operation. And from that moment, we can say that the Russians will be pretty experienced in this process, and of course it's not a very good idea to stop this process. If you have experience, you need to develop this experience, and as soon as the Russians complete with this mobilization process, they need to continue more and more with this training process, this mobilization process, and I believe that this territory defense is going to be the next thing that the Russians will try to prepare or create. It will be some kind of reserves. Of course, after 2 or 3 months of some trainings under the territory defense, a lot of these guys will sign a contract and will join the regular army, and the Russians will be able to create like ongoing process of recruiting. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you, you can condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.